right, we got a fun one tonight. We are diving into the front suspension on my truck once again, and I hope this is going to be the last time that I actually have to dive into the suspension this deep. So what we're going to be doing in this video is replacing the top hat style leveling kit that I have on the truck currently with a set of Bilstein 5100s. So if you've been following my videos for a while, you know I've been chasing some issues that I've been having in the front suspension on my Rebel. So several videos back, I went ahead and installed a 2-inch leveling kit on the truck. It's a top hat style. It's not the preload spacer style. It's basically remove the strut, slap the spacer on top, and then throw the strut back in, let everything go. Things were okay for a little while, but after I started driving on it and kind of beating on it a little bit, I noticed I was getting a clunking noise up front. And what was happening is at that time I was running factory control arms. The factory control arms were actually hitting my spring. So there's some wear marks on my spring because the suspension was articulating so much that the control arm was basically slapping the spring. So I went ahead and replaced the factory control arms with these new rough country ones. So that resolved the issue a little bit. It bought me a little bit more travel, but it didn't completely resolve the contact issue. Ultimately, when you install a spacer, a top hat style one specifically, on a strut, you're essentially moving the travel of the strut down. And by doing that, I moved where the strut bottoms out down. So no longer will that strut bottom out before any of the control arms or before anything starts hitting something else. So by adding that spacer there, I moved the strut down, which extended the amount of travel that the factory suspension was expected to work on. And that caused the basically over articulation of this control arm and hitting the spring. So with the factory suspension, because we don't have any sort of welded or ledged bump stop, so on a GM, if you look down on the control arm, you'll see up on the upper control arm, you'll see that the upper control arm will rest on a little bracket that sticks out from the chassis. That's a bump stop, and that stops the suspension from overextending. On these trucks, the only thing that's going to stop it from overextending is either that strut bottoming out or contact. So in my case, right now, when I have my truck lifted up in the air, that upper control arm is basically leaning on that spring, and that's no bueno. You don't want that. My thinking here is that by replacing this leveling kit with a proper kit, like a Bilstein 5100 kit, I'm going to go ahead and remove that, or I'm going to move the travel of the suspension back up to almost factory settings, and then I'll still be able to retain my 2 inches of lift in the front of the truck. So in theory, I hope this resolves my upper control arm and spring issue. I haven't heard of anyone running the 5100s with aftermarket control arms having this issue. I have heard of people running the same leveling kit that I have with factory components or even aftermarket control arms and having this issue. So in theory, the Bilstein 5100 should resolve this. So let's go take a look at them real quick. So on the factory Rebel, they come with Bilstein 4600s in the front and then Bilstein 4600s with reservoirs in the rear. But I'm actually hearing that some of the newer trucks don't come with the reservoirs. But ultimately, they come with 4600s, which are monotube shocks and monotube struts. They are, in essence, the same internals as a Bilstein 5100 strut. So there's two differences between what I'm looking at here and what's currently on my truck. First difference is the most obvious. These are zinc plated, so they look nice, versus your conventional yellow and blue Bilstein struts. And that's their factory colors, and that's why they come in that. Now, I don't like painted struts because after a while they end up rusting and peeling. They look like crap. The other thing you get with these Bilstein 5100s, like I said, is the adjustability. So these things are the go-to adjustable strut on the market right now. So I picked these up from BilsteinLifts, I think about $264, and shipping was super fast. So I'm really excited to get these guys in. What do you get in the kit? You get the Bilstein 5100s, you get the spring adapters, which I'm hearing that we don't need on our Rebels, but I'll confirm that throughout the process here. You get the jounce stoppers, so basically this little cap goes on top of the strut body itself and protects it from the bump stop that ultimately slips on the shaft of the strut. And then you get 2 new king nuts, which will fit on the Bilstein struts. So I said these were adjustable, and they are adjustable via these little ridges here. So if you look closely on the Bilstein struts, you'll see, I think it's 7 circlips or 7 locations here. And basically what you can do here is you can move this little circlip up and down here, and by doing that, you dictate where the bottom of your spring will sit, and ultimately that will control the lift of your truck. So let me grab the instructions real quick, and we'll talk about what these mean and what they will equate to on the truck at the end of the day. All right, so we have our instructions here, and what you'll notice right away, and this is for the Bilstein 5100s as well as the 6112s. So the 6112s are essentially the same thing. I believe they come with a different spring, but they are a fatter strut. I think they're about 2.5 inches wide, so more oil, more dampening. Awesome for extreme off-road conditions, whereas the 5100s are excellent for a daily driver. So anyway, we have seven of these locations that you can move this circlip to. We have the bottom one, which will be your factory height, and then the top one, which is the most extreme lift. However, before you pick what height you go to, you got to look at the Bilstein instructions, because the height that these will generate on your specific truck is dictated by the spring package that you have on your truck. So remember, on my truck, so I got a Rebel, which is going to be the same case as the off-road package trucks where you have that 1-inch lift. The lift heights are going to be different for this truck than they would be for a normal Ram that doesn't have the Rebel package or the off-road package. So if I take that circlip and I put it in position 1, it's ultimately going to equate to a stock ride height. So it's going to be stock across the board on both ride heights. So stock in the off-road package or Rebel package is going to equal a 1-inch lift over the non-height. But again, if you're just doing a strut for strut replacement and you don't want any lift, you put that circlip on the lowest location or lowest spot, then you're good to go. Now this is where it starts to get a little bit different. So as you go up in numbers as far as the location, again, you're raising that perch. So you're taking the perch that was down here and you're starting to move it up the strut. That will start to lift your truck up in the front. And that's where it pays to pay attention to the instructions here. So in my application, I want to, again, I had a 2-inch leveling on here before. I want to retain that 2-inch lift. So what I'm going to do is take that circlip and put it at position 5, which will equate to a 2-inch lift. Again, I'm gonna sound like a broken record here. So a 2-inch lift on a Rebel will ultimately be a 3-inch lift compared to the non-off-road package trucks. So just keep that in mind. Now, if I had a regular truck without those extended springs and I put the clip at position number 5, that will only give me a 1.7-inch lift. Now, if you have an off-road package or a Rebel, the Bilstein instructions say do not use 6 or 7. And I suspect the reason they do this is because if you start to run this perch way too high with those extended springs, you're either A, going to have a really crappy ride quality, or B, you're not even going to be able to get that spring on there because it's going to be so dang compressed that you're not going to have the leeway to slip this nut over the top. And ultimately, that will equate to a really bad and really harsh ride quality. So for an off-road package or for a Rebel package truck, when you're doing a Bilsteins, the max ride height you could get out of these things as far as adjustment is 2 inches of lift, which is 2 inches plus your longer springs, which is giving you 3 inches of lift at the end of the day. Now, you could run any of the lower heights as well, but in my case, I'm going to go to position number 5. So I already have the circlips moved up there. Now, if you have the non-off-road package truck, the maximum ride height you can get out of these struts is by taking that circlip, throwing it up on the top lip here, having your perch drop, or basically raising your perch to the maximum amount you can get out of these things, and that's going to equate to a 2.6-inch lift. So a non-off-road package truck will essentially have close to 3 inches of lift, whereas on the off-road package, you can only get 2 inches out of these guys, which is 2 inches plus the factory level. So you're going to have 3 inches of lift ultimately with respect to the factory Rebel or factory non-off-road package trucks. Sort of confusing, but just remember, off-road packages and Rebels have 1 inch from the factory, which is why you have to use different settings here because you have a longer spring. Now, if you're replacing the spring altogether and going to a different one, that all goes out the window. This is only if you're retaining that factory spring and using them with your Bilsteins. That was a lot. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. I'll happily answer those. Been doing a lot of digging into this stuff, so happy to have a discussion on this one. So as far as tools, we will need your typical ratchets, large wrenches, so 18 millimeters and up. Suspension stuff on these trucks takes the big bolts, so you're going to need everything from an 18 to a 21, 22, and 24 to get the job done here. Obviously, a breaker bar, that was for get my wheels off. Torque wrench. Anytime you do suspension, do not waste time on doing the work if you're not going to torque everything down properly and then complain about knocking noises. If you don't torque it down, expect bad results. We have our spring compressors, so if you are not comfortable with compressing the springs on these trucks, then do not do this project. You could pull these Bilsteins out of your truck, you could take them to a shop, and they'll gladly for a small fee. They'll gladly swap out the struts, and then you can bring them back and reinsert them back in your truck. But in my video tonight, we're gonna go ahead and compress those springs so we could do everything turnkey in my own garage. Obviously, a bunch of impact sockets, my cordless impact gun, and we should be good to go. So like I said, I'm gonna dig into the suspension, and then once we get everything taken apart, we'll kind of walk through step by step and get into how we upgrade to the 5100s. So let's do it. All right, so we are gonna do our driver's side strut. So we're gonna replace this strut right now that has a 2-inch leveling kit. So it's a top hat spacer style leveling kit. We're gonna pull that guy off, and we're gonna replace him with one of the Bilstein 5100s. So just a clear shot at the issue I'm currently having. So you can see the control arm right now. This is the Rough Country control arm, forged aluminum. This is literally resting on one of the coils for the spring. And the reason it's doing that is because adding a 2-inch top hat style spacer pushes the strut down so much and increases the travel downward that you end up running into a potential issue where this control arm will hit the spring. And it really depends on the orientation of the spring if you're gonna have this issue. But even if I wasn't hitting, it would still be really close and a little too close for comfort. So as far as the removal of the strut, so the first thing you're gonna do is obviously jack your truck up, get your tire off or get your wheel off, and then start getting a lay of the land. So what we're gonna do here is a couple things. One, we already went ahead and removed the sway bar because I had to work on the other side, and you wanna make sure that that sway bar is loosened from both lower control arms. That way it gives you the ability to work on each hub assembly on its own. If you had that sway bar attached, it'd fight you basically as far as jacking it up and down, trying to get everything lined up. So go ahead and undo that sway bar end link. It is an 18mm nut that goes through the bottom of the lower control arm, and it feeds right into the end link right here. And then just go ahead and tuck that guy up out of the way. Then the next thing we're gonna do is take a 21mm wrench, and we're gonna loosen up the ball joint nut. And then, so basically just do that. It's pretty simple. Now, we might get lucky and it might pop on its own. Otherwise, what we'll end up having to do is loosen this up enough so we could see some threads between the nut and the knuckle. And then we'll just go ahead and hit this guy with a big hammer to free up that ball joint. So sometimes it takes a few whacks. On the other side, this guy just basically popped off on its own. So I don't think it'll take too much effort to get this guy popped off. So after we go ahead and break the ball joint free on that guy, we're gonna go ahead to this tie rod end link down here. And same thing, use a 21mm wrench to loosen up the nut on the bottom of the tie rod. At that point, once we get the upper control arm free, tie rod free, we're gonna go ahead and take a strap and we're gonna attach that strap to the chassis here, down through the wheel studs, and then back over there, because we're gonna loosen up this guy and completely remove that nut and just let him pop up out of the way. Then we could go ahead and start loosening up our strut. And the strut is 16mm nuts on the top, a 24mm nut, and a 22mm bolt on the bottom. So we'll go ahead and work on this upper control arm, tie rod, and then get everything tied up so then we can start loosening up everything else. So let's get rocking. Okay, now that I got the tie rod end link removed, I have the ball joint freed up. It only took 2 whacks with a big hammer to free up the ball joint here. Sway bar is undone, and then I have my strap here to prevent the hub assembly from tipping forward, because once you undo the tie rod end link, you're going to lose the ability to control the hub assembly this way. And then once you undo the ball joint up here, the upper ball joint, you're then going to lose the ability to keep that hub assembly parallel to the rest of the truck. So it's going to want to tip forward because of how heavy the brake assembly is. So you put that strap there and it'll leave everything in place. And it's nice to have a strap that's adjustable so you could loosen it and then you could tighten it as you're pulling the strut out. It just makes things a heck of a lot easier. All right, the next thing we're gonna do is make sure that we make sure that we mark the clocking of the spring. And basically what that means is we wanna make sure that that spring, as well as the top hat assembly and the bottom mount, are coming out of the truck and going back in the same orientation. So we want to make sure that this portion of the spring is pointing out once we get it onto the new strut. So I have a rag here because everything's caked in salt. So I'm gonna go ahead and wipe everything down just so I could put a nice clean mark with a marker on here. And that way we know what side of the spring needs to be lined up with the bolt. And then what I'll end up doing is then working on that 22mm bolt that has a 24mm nut on it. That's the lower strut mount. And then I believe these are 16mm. Let's double check that. Let's see. Yep, So those are 16 millimeter. These are pretty simple to undo. So I'm gonna undo this nut here, free up the upper control arm, then we're good to go. The whole lower assembly is ready and it is prepped to move out of the way to get this guy out of there. And then I'm gonna undo the top, undo the bottom, and then this guy pops right out, and then we'll go ahead and compress that spring and get this guy transplanted over on the 5100. All right, so I got my upper control arm free, tie rod free, sway bar end link off. I got the upper top mount or top strut mount nuts off. I got the big bolt that's holding the bottom of the strut out. Now this guy is just loose and he's just floating around in there. So what I'm gonna do now with two hands, won't be able to do this on camera, but I'm basically gonna lower this guy slowly. So I'm just gonna slowly release some of this, and what you're gonna see is that hub assembly is gonna slowly start to move this way. And I'll help it a little bit. That way I could get enough space in here to pop this guy out. So it's going to be helpful if you have a pry bar, because you're going to be able to lift this guy all the way up, and what you want to do, leave the top mount still in place, pull the strut up as high as you can, put a little pry bar inside the hoop on the bottom of the strut, and use that to pry it straight out. So basically, let's see. So I'm going to take, once I get that strut up and high, I'm going to take this little pry bar here and just push everything down and pry that bottom out. Once I get the bottom out, that strut's going to want to drop this way, and then we'll just slowly release it and pull it out. Then we will get everything transplanted over to the 5100. Okay, so the strut is pulled out. I just wanted to show you something that I forgot to mention earlier. Be very careful with your hoses here. So you got your ABS brake wire, and then you got your brake fluid hose. So basically, that is what's telling you how far you can go. That in conjunction with your axle. So as long as you keep your CV in check and keep an eye on those guys, pulling this guy out shouldn't be an issue. Especially if you don't have a leveling kit and you're just pulling out the stock assembly, it's pretty easy to get it out, and it'll be easy to get the 5100s back in. If you have a top hat on there, it's kind of a pain in the butt to pull it out because you did already have to shove that thing in there. So it took a little bit of wrestling, but we got it out. So let's get that guy switched over to the 5100. All right, this is the part of the show that is not for the faint of heart, because now we're going to whip out the spring compressors and we're going to use those. But the first thing we need to do, first we would need to make sure that we clocked the spring correctly and we at least marked everything. So my line is right here. So this was the outside bolt for the strut, and that lined up with, there's a bunch of marks down here as well. And I'll just go ahead and draw them in a little bit better, because basically what you want to do, you want to make sure that the bottom of this strut, this section, is in line with one of the bolts. So one of these top mount strut nut bolts here should be right down the dead center middle of this, because that's how it mounts in there. And actually these things could be flipped either way, so you can mount them either this way or that way. There's really no front or back. It's just however you disassemble it, make sure you always have one of those nuts directly in line with the middle of here, and that's how you clock everything. I've heard that there might be some taper to here, so best to just kind of keep everything as is. I don't really know if there is. I've looked. I can't really tell. But draw a line down that nut, draw it down the spring, draw it on the bottom mount, and then just make sure that when you go to transplant this guy onto the 5100, the 5100's assembly is oriented exactly the same, and then you're good to go. So the first thing I need to do is remove my 2-inch leveling kit. And then after that, we're going to go ahead and put those guys on the spring. We're going to try to space them out as far as possible on these spring runs, because it actually is easier to compress the spring farther away than it is to try to grab 2 coils and squeeze it out. These things, I've compressed a ton of springs in the past. These do not need much. For whatever reason, these things pop off with just a little bit of tension on those guys, and the spring frees up. So I'm not sure if it's just the way these things are assembled, or I'm just got lucky with everything. But I've had springs in the past where I've had them basically, the coils are almost touching and it's still barely able to free up that nut. But essentially what we're going to do here is put the spring compressors on there. We're going to put one on this side, one on that side. We're going to slowly tighten them. We're going to go a little bit at a time. And then we're going to do that until we can move the strut assembly inside the spring. So hold the spring. If you could twist the strut assembly, you're good to go. It's loosening up. And then we're going to go and we're going to remove this king nut. And I think that's an 18 millimeter nut, but we'll get that once we get enough of the tension taken off of these springs. Wear eye protection, wear hand protection. This is a dangerous part. Again, if you are uncomfortable with this, this is a lot of force. It's almost like dealing with a garage door spring, possibly a little bit more force. And if those break, they're just going to shear and they're going to pop and they're going to basically shatter and pieces are going to go everywhere. So again, if you're uncomfortable with this step, or if this just is outside of your wheelhouse, definitely just take it to a shop. If you could find a mom and pop shop, a lot of times they'll charge you $50 to just to assemble these, and it might be well worth the payment to just get rid of the risk. Anyway, I've done this a few times. Actually took apart that strut at least 3 times, just trying to make sure everything's set up the right way. So let's go ahead and get that leveling kit off of here, get the spring compressors tightened up, and then start working on disassembling this, and then we could look at how we assemble the new 5100. All right, so we got these guys screwed down enough that everything's loosened up in here, so I can move that strut a little bit inside there, which is all you really need. The second you can move the strut body in there, that's when you know the spring is loosened enough. So now what we're gonna do is take an 18mm socket, go ahead and put it on top of the king nut, or I guess the top nut for the shaft. So this is the nut that's holding the top mount to the rest of the strut. So there's a bar or a little rod that goes all the way through this dust shield, pops up through here, and that's what the nut threads on, and that holds this whole assembly on, and it basically holds everything together, and which is why you need to compress it. So we're going to use an 18mm socket to take that nut off, and the second we do that, we'll be able to pull all the parts off. So as far as borrowing parts, so we don't need a strut body anymore, but what we need is pretty much everything from here up. So we need the bottom mount, we need the spring, obviously, we need the rubber insulator, as well as the top mount and the dust shield. We're going to reuse that as well. And then there's a bump stop inside on the shaft that we're going to pull off, and we're going to put it on here. So let's get this guy pulled apart, and I'll show you the parts next to the new 5100 and show you the differences once you get them installed. So let's do it. All right, so we got that strut disassembled. That guy put up a fight. Basically what happened here is the end of it's pretty rusted, and that rust was getting sucked into the nut while I was trying to remove it. So basically it locked up the nut on there. So it took a whole lot of elbow grease. I'm going to be super sore tomorrow because of that little nut on that strut. But it's off, so we're good to go. So we got the 2 struts here, as well as some of the parts. So this is our factory strut. It still has the lower perch on it, so we need to remove this guy. So basically what we're gonna do is flip it upside down like this, and we're gonna gently tap with a hammer until this guy loosens up. So one thing that I found is super helpful, especially if your truck is pretty dirty, is wipe this off first. This is a really close tolerance to the body of the strut, and if you got dirt on there, it's gonna make it a little bit harder. So spray penetrating oil in here, clean this part up, and then just slowly tap with a hammer, and this will pop this way. It will not go that way. There's a clip inside there, just like there is right here. So you're gonna have to hit it towards the rod of the strut. Then when you get it down to here, it's gonna push up against there. Just gently hit this guy with a hammer, and it'll slowly push this little cap off. Then you're good to go. So we have our OEM strut removed. We're gonna get that lower perch, and now we have our Bilstein 5100 set up, ready to go. So remember, we're going for a 2-inch lift. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm on the 5th position on the body of the strut from the bottom of the strut. So the bottom of the strut, this little U mount. So I'm on the 5th setting on here. There's 7 of them total. These 2 you will not use with the Rebel or the off-road package truck. Then we're gonna go ahead and transplant the lower perch onto here. It'll slide right on. It'll stop on the circlips. And then we're gonna take this guy. He's gonna pop over the shaft on the strut, like so. And he'll basically be just like that guy. So it's called a jounce stopper, I guess. So we're gonna gently tap with a hammer so he sits down. He'll be just above those little divots in the body of the strut. Then we'll slide our strut on all the way, and we'll make sure that the little end of the coil itself ends up in that pocket. Then bump stop comes off of the strut on the OEM strut, and it'll slide onto the Bilstein 5100. Then we'll drop our dust boot, as well as our insulator and our top mount down through the top of the strut, and that's where we start paying attention to the lines we drew, because we want to make sure that those lines line up with the mark we made on our spring, and then that those ultimately line up so we can mount this thing and not have any issues. Whew, that guy put up a huge fight. Holy cow. All right. So let me go ahead and get this guy assembled, and then we will get this guy ready to put back in the truck. All right, so the 5100 is prepped. We got the lower perch on there. We got it set on the 5th setting. We can only see 1 ring. That's good. That's the same as the passenger side. We have the jounce stopper. We have the bump stop. And now this guy is ready to go to slide him through the spring. We have the top mount assembly ready to go. And remember, we put a mark on this top nut. So that is going to line up with the line on our spring here, and then this guy will basically just tuck up against the spring coil itself, and then we'll make sure that between this nut goes straight down the spring, and then that lines up in the middle of here, then we're good to go. Then we'll slip the top nut that came with the Bilsteins on. Hand tighten this with a hand tool, not an impact wrench. We don't want to be spinning the shaft. And then we can loosen up the tension and we're good to go to pop this guy back in the truck. So let's get this thing fully assembled and get it ready to go in the truck. Now, one thing, the kit does come with these little spring retainers. These are not used with the Rebel kit because remember, you're replacing 4600s with 5100s. They're essentially the same strut. And since you remove that lower perch off of a clip on the 4600s, it will mount much the same on the 5100s. These are the same diameter between these two. I believe these would come into play if you have the normal shocks, so not the upgraded Bilstein shocks. So because we're basically swapping the same strut, just different, just one's adjustable, one's not, we don't need these guys. So we're gonna leave those out and we'll toss those out afterwards. I confirmed this because I went ahead and installed the Bilstein on the passenger side and I measured it, and the measurement is the same as it was before with the 2-inch leveling kit, so we're good to go on that. Don't freak out when you measure this strut after you assemble it here and it doesn't measure the same length as, let's say, one with a top hat spacer on. This leveling kit works much different than the way those top hat spacer ones do. So let's get this guy assembled and get him ready to go back on the truck. All right, our Bilstein is ready to go to get thrown back up into the truck. Now, if you're in the same scenario where I'm at, where you're removing a puck style leveling kit and going to the lifted strut like this, you're going to realize that it's a hell of a lot easier to flip the 5100 in here than it was to put the puck style strut back in there, because you're no longer messing with that extended travel that those pucks create. So we're going to reverse the orientation with how we remove this guy. So when we remove the strut, we popped it off the bottom first and then slid it down. First thing we're going to do to reinstall is slide it up and make sure that the top mount strut nuts or strut bolts go through the top 3 holes. And then we're going to use a pry bar just to flip it up over the lower control arm. This should be pretty easy because it's a shorter strut than what you likely removed if you removed a leveling kit. If you removed your OEM strut, this is basically the same length and we're good to go. So let's go ahead and get this guy popped up in there and then start reassembling everything. All right, so our Bilstein 5100 is installed and good to go. And the best thing of all, I finally resolved the contact issue with the upper control arm. So that goes to show you what was causing that issue was that that leveling kit, so that top hat style leveling kit. So the best way to do it is just to replace it with the Bilstein 5100s. So let me move the light out of the way and then let's talk through the steps real quick here, and then I'll give you all the torque numbers so you can finish up your project as well. All right. So to get started after you remove the wheel, well, first of all, one thing you should do whenever you're doing suspension work is take measurements. I took measurements from the ground to the edge of my fender right here. I wrote them all down, and I'll take post measurements after I'm able to drive the car for a little bit because I want to see what the difference was. Now, again, if you remember, I removed a 2-inch leveling kit. So theoretically, with those set, with the Bilstein set at 2 inches, I should not have changed the height of my truck. Removing your factory strut, first thing you want to do is obviously get that truck jacked up and remove the wheel. Then you want to remove the nut on the upper ball joint. You want to remove the tie rod. Leave enough threads on this guy so when you remove that tie rod, you can go ahead and hit this guy with a hammer to break the upper control arm free. Get a strap, hook it to this point here, down through your wheel studs, and back to that point on that frame. And then that will hold your hub assembly. Go ahead and take that nut completely off and free up the upper control arm. Take your tie rod, tuck it up out of the way. Make sure you undo the sway bar end links on both sides. Once you have the sway bar freed up, upper control arm done, and the tie rod end link removed, the next thing you want to do is go ahead and remove the bottom strut mount bolt. Remember, that's a 22 millimeter socket on the outside. It's a 24 millimeter wrench on the inside. Hit it with an impact wrench and that guy will come right off. Then you want to undo the top 3 nuts on top of the strut. Those are 3 16 millimeter nuts. Once you do that, you'll be able to slide the strut completely out of the truck. Go ahead and swap all the hardware over from your factory truck or factory strut over to the 5100s, and then just reverse the order. Make sure you pick the right circlip position on your 5100, so confirm it, double, triple, quadruple check that before you get it in the truck. That way you're 100% positive that everything's set up correctly, and then just reverse the order. So as far as torque settings, I got your torque numbers here. Give me a second. Open up my phone. All right, so When you tighten down this guy, this is 65 foot-pounds, so the upper ball joint is 65 foot-pounds. The lower strut mount is 150 foot-pounds. The top strut nuts are 30 foot-pounds apiece. And let's see, tie rod end, I believe this is about 35. Yeah, I'm gonna say 35 foot-pounds. Nothing crazy in these tie rods. It's just enough to hold it in there. And then sway bar. I don't think it has a number on that one. We'll go with 35. Yeah, 35 as well for the sway bar. So sway bar to the frame, sway bar to the lower control arm is 35 foot-pounds. So 35, 35, 35, is that what it is? 65, 150 on the lower strut, and then 30 up top, and then you're good to go. So like I said, I'm gonna go ahead and take this for a test drive, drive around on these struts for a little bit, and then we'll get back with kind of final thoughts on this. But honestly, this is the way to level your Rebel or your off-road truck. Don't mess around with the leveling kits, those top hat mounted. They're more of a headache than anything, and this is the best way to do it. You want to retain that factory suspension travel because you want to be able to stop this control arm with the strut, not stop it by it bouncing off of your spring. So with the upgrade to the 5100s, I was able to retain this suspension travel. So awesome upgrade, and I'm super happy that I finally figured this out and resolved it. I'll be updating my posts on the forum as well as the Facebook and Instagram groups, but this is the way to level your Rebel or your off-road package outfitted Ram truck. So let me get the wheel back on and take it for a test drive a little bit, and then we'll get back with what my thoughts are as far as road comfort. I don't think I'm going to see a huge improvement over my factory struts because, again, these are essentially the same ones. I'll just be riding it a little bit higher. So I was really happy with the ride quality before. I'm sure I'll be just as happy now. These might be a little bit better than my OEM Plus leveling kit, but as far as OEM to 5100s, it might be almost a smack dab identical ride quality. Maintaining the ride quality plus a 2-inch lift, you can't beat that with the 5100s. So let's get the wheel put back on there, get this guy off the jack stands and take it for a test drive and come back, and I'll let you know what I think of these struts once I drive it around for a little bit. Alright guys, I installed the 5100s last Friday. It's now Sunday, late afternoon, so I figured I've gotten some road time on them and give you kind of my thoughts on what I think of them. And I absolutely love them. Driving on the 5100s, I feel like my ride quality improved significantly. And maybe it's because I fixed my travel issue, but ultimately installing these 5100s was definitely a value add or a win for my truck. So as far as final measurements, I ended up retaining just under 2 inches of lift in the front. So now I have a 1/4 inch of rake between the front and the rear of the truck, and I don't have any sort of lift in the rear, so I just have the factory off-road package springs in the rear right now. But I retain, like I said, I have like almost 1.7, 1.8 inches of lift in the front, so awesome. And with my 34s, I don't have any rubbing issues. I have 34s on 1mm offset wheels, so definitely no issue at all. Like I said, the ride quality is awesome, and the best part about it is I resolved my issue with my upper control arms hitting my spring. So because I went with the 5100s, they were able to correct the suspension travel, and return the bump stop to where it needs to be in order to stop those upper control arms from hitting the spring. So as far as my top 5 takeaways from the 5100 install, first and foremost, I'm happy that it resolved that upper control arm issue. So I was losing a lot of sleep over that, and now that I have the 5100s in where the bump stop is stopping the suspension from over traveling, it's peace of mind. And now, you know, you can off-road, you could beat on it a little bit, and you're not fearing that your upper control arms are going to hit your spring so hard that you're going to end up popping a ball joint out of there. So that's awesome. Number 2, just shy of 2 inches of lift. So like I said, I got 1.7, 1.8 inches, which is about par. I've heard that a lot, where a Bilstein 2-inch lift doesn't really equate to a 2-inch lift at the end of the day. Sometimes it's just shy of that. So in my application with my truck, I'm just shy of that, which then gave me that 1/4 inch of rake between the front and the rear of the truck, which looks tasteful. Number 3, remember with the Bilstein 5100, so if you're replacing Bilstein 4600, so the shocks or the struts that come stock on your Ram Rebel, with the Bilstein 5100s, the strut body is the exact same, so you don't need those spring retainers that come in the kit. All right, number 4, prepare for a fight with that top nut. So Couple things. One, get an offset 18mm wrench, which will help you access that top nut, and then tons of penetrating oil, because you're going to need to really clean off that rust before you go at that nut once you get the strut out of the truck. Try to do your best to prep the threads before you start backing off that nut, because the more rust you can get off before you remove the nut, the easier that nut's going to come off. And the final point from this installation that kind of surprised me was the springs did not need that much compression. I've heard people getting 2 sets of spring compressors to compress these off-road package springs. I only needed 1 kit that I picked up from O'Reilly's or Advanced Auto Parts, I forget where I got it, and it required barely any sort of compression in order to loosen up that spring enough to get everything off of the strut. So at the end of the day, it was a super easy install once I got beyond those nuts on the top of the strut. So with that said, just shy of 2 inches of lift, Bilstein 5100s. That's how you install it. If you got any questions, leave them down in the description below, and I will leave a link to where I bought these. Like I said, I bought these from BilsteinLifts, and they were the only ones that have them in stock. These 5100s, they fly off the shelves real fast, and I was able to get on an email group with the BilsteinLifts team, where the second they came in stock, I got an email saying, hey, they're here, let's get them ordered up. So I think last time I checked, they had 30 kits available, so definitely pick them up. If you are going to lift your Rebel or your off-road Ram truck, 5100s is the way to do it. Don't waste time with getting a leveling kit with the pucks or the preload spacers. You will save yourself a ton of headaches in the long run by doing it this way versus doing the pucks. So 5100s, new upper control arms, that is the way to lift and level the front end of your Ram Rebel or off-road package Ram. I haven't done anything with the rears yet, so I still have the 4600 with reservoirs, and I'm not really sure what I'm going to do. Do I go ahead and just replace those with the 5100 rear shocks, which will match the front? I don't know. The ride quality is awesome right now. Why would I screw with it anymore? But if I do, you can bet that there's going to be a video on it. But with that said, thank you very much for watching the Bilstein 5100 installation video. If you have any questions on this, either hit me up on my YouTube video, or in the comments on my YouTube video, or definitely hit me up on Instagram. I love the conversation. You guys are chatting me up constantly, and I'm having a blast talking about nothing but trucks with you all. So with that said, appreciate it. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good one.